Hello, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and esteemed guests. My name is Jane Witherspoon. I'm the Bureau Chief for the Middle East for Euronews, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here today for what promises to be a very exciting panel. We're going to be looking at Super App Supremacy. And as you probably saw there, my panel are eager to get on the stage. They've just tried to follow me straight on. But just before I do invite them on, I wanted to talk about what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be looking at how super apps are disrupting previously untapped markets. Have super app companies become the new regional geoeconomic power player? And in what ways could super apps hold back innovation by building monopolies on digital interactions? So without further ado, if you could please put your hands together as we invite our first panel guest to the stage, Fadi Ghandour, Executive Chairman for Wamda Capital. And next, Mostafa Kandil, Founder and CEO of SWVL. Tomaso Rodriguez, CEO of Talabat. Welcome. Mudassir Sheikha, co-founder and CEO of Careem. And finally, Noor, Sweid, General Partner for Global Ventures. Welcome, Noor. So, chaps, this is going to be quite a fun panel because you all know each other, which is really nice because we can have it very much more conversational. But I will start with Fadi. You each have your microphones. Fadi, Wamda is a platform that invests and nurtures and builds entrepreneurship ecosystems across the Middle East and North Africa. How can super apps be embraced by tech hubs and these ecosystems?
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Talking about super apps, I feel I am a cheerleader for the super app guys here. Look, the critical element, if I want to take a bit of a different angle on your question, is how can the infrastructure for enabling super apps and any other digital economy companies to be able to go out and launch their services in the region. Specifically, I'm addressing this issue specifically related to the regulators of the region. So super apps without fintech, without payment systems, without the capability of having, well, that's what a super app is. So there is, you go into a super app and you're able to do everything that you need to do in terms of your services and whatever you want to buy, sell, pay, groceries, transportation, etc. So super apps will play an extremely important role in the ecosystem, but the enablers of the ecosystem in the region, other than the funders, which is basically the regulators and government, have to be able to step up to make sure that these super apps and any other apps that are based on the regulatory frameworks need to work well. And my last point on this subject is we need to have super apps able to do cross-border work, specifically around fintech. So the interoperability of the payment systems and of financial systems across markets in the Arab world and specifically in the GCC are going to be able to enable these super apps to actually scale and scale very quickly rather than face continuous challenges of having different regulatory frameworks in different markets and thus creating all sorts of bottlenecks that are hindering their ability to actually offer the services that they want.
Do you think that's going to need a regulatory compliance across the whole board?
Well, I think you know, let me talk GCC only because there is that base. The GCC was built around the cooperation. I mean, that's what it's called, GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. It would be fantastic if we get somewhere of a supra, if you want, a supra regulator that enables at least that transporting process in terms of financial services across all these markets. There needs to be that discussion and that very serious discussion of cooperation and creating interoperability rather than maybe a little bit of a competitive environment in today's world.
I'm going to bring in Noor. Noor, you're one of the world's top 50 women in tech. Global Ventures has made over 56 investments, I believe. And I think you're very keen to pick up on something that's just been mentioned when we talk about local and global ecosystems. What drives the super app evolution, and how does that journey differ here in the Middle East, and how has it impacted local ecosystems compared to globally?
So thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining. I'll start with saying that I agree completely with Fadi's perspective, and that it is about the regulator. To the extent that a regulator can facilitate cross-border transactions from a fintech perspective, these apps become exponentially more useful. I think when we think about the evolution of the super app and the purpose of the super app, and start there, it's a little bit of a different conversation, because it really is about the consumer and the user journey. And in different markets, users require and need some of the same things, like the groceries and the pharmacies, but many of different things. Mobility looks very different in different parts of the world. Let's start there. And then you carry on with the user journey and what that looks like, the onboarding financially, the different types of financial services used to consume different digital products. So when we think about how companies scale globally, and this was the earlier point we were talking about, and you think about how they scale cross-border, software companies, they're consumed in the same way because it's the same demand across the world. So those companies have a different path to scale. When you think about super apps, it is what is the common denominator of the desired user journey, and then what is the common denominator of the regulator's ability to accept different systems on one platform that will enable super apps to grow more globally. So it's a very different journey, and it starts with what does the consumer want? But I think Mudassir had this conversation with me 6 months ago.
I was going to bring in Mudassir at this point, because obviously Careem is a leading technology platform for the region. You do have a broader approach. What has been the biggest challenge in terms of that? Are you finding consumers fighting for space within your realms?
Yeah, look, let me start by building on what Fadi and Noor have said. Building a digital service in our region is doubly hard, and I'll tell you why it's doubly hard. One is a lot of the enabling infrastructure that many other companies can take for granted in the Western world, whether it is maps, points of interest databases, credit card payments, communication systems, all of these things are available through APIs and services that companies elsewhere can just build on and launch their services. Unfortunately, in this part of the world, it's getting better, but for the most part, we still have to build that enabling infrastructure to launch a digital service. In the early days of Careem, we built our own maps, our own points of interest database. We had to build a collection network for cash that was collected by our captains. And none of these things are required by players like us in other parts of the world. So that's one challenge, that you have to do this vertical integration almost to launch a service. Then comes the issue of, we live in a region that is quite fragmented. Yes, there are some large economies in the region, but the region doesn't have a very large economy like the US or China that can actually bring the scale required to build these large technology platforms, which basically means that you have to expand to other parts of the region. Now, you did all of these things in one country. These things now have to be replicated in the next country, and the third country, and the fourth country. It is prohibitively expensive and difficult to build a regional business that has the scale that can justify the investment required to build these platforms. So where super apps really come in is, many of our services had to build all of these things in all the different markets. What we are basically trying to do through the super app is create an abstraction layer that everyone else can build on top of. So if you are a service provider, if you are an entrepreneur that wants to build a service and don't have the money or the resources to build all of the enabling, you build on top of the Careem super app, which has done all of these things, and launch your services much less investment than would be required if you didn't have that platform. And not only can you do this in one country, with the flick of a switch, you can do it in the second country, and the third country, and the fourth country. So I often give people the example that, imagine how the US would work if you had to go from one state to another state and you had to do all of these things. None of these big companies would have come out of the US. So inshallah, what we are trying to do is create an abstraction layer, which is a super app layer, through which you take advantage of all the enabling things that we have built, and then very comfortably expand the service to all other parts of the region. In the same way a California company goes to New York, a company started in Morocco or a Saudi can very easily go to Egypt or Jordan if they want to. So that's the unlock that happens through the super app.
Tomaso, I think this is your cue to come in because Talabat come from a very different angle from Careem, and we talked about this earlier off stage. You know, how is Talabat embracing and cementing its position in the super app space?
Thank you, Jane, for the cue. And sorry, Mudassir, probably going to go a bit against what you said, but for us, I think it's a bit different. What do we think is, apps should build kind of ecosystems, right? Instead of like the super app concept. And what I mean by that is when we think of super apps, I think the most successful examples of super apps that we see are in China, right? And WeChat has been really the first super app, and it always was coming from a customer pain point, right? People were chatting on a WhatsApp-like system, and at some point they needed to send money to each other, and there was no infrastructure to do that. And WeChat built that. And after that, there was poor network connections in the rural China, right? Like, we say rural China, but we're talking about cities with millions of people. That's called rural China. But the connection was poor, and so they started building a very low bandwidth usage system where people can download small apps inside of the bigger apps, right? And so it was always coming from a customer type of pain point, right? I think in other parts of the world, super app companies do a bit the opposite. They say, okay, I have a lot of traffic in my app coming from one service that is going very well. What else can I sell to my consumers, right? And that, I think, if it doesn't come from a customer pain point at the beginning, it inevitably ends up in, fighting for space inside the app and competing services trying to sell one over the other, right? So what we believe is, so Talabat started as a food delivery company, right? And we're very focused on food for 15 years of our life. In the last 2 years, we started focusing on groceries and other services around food. And we said, okay, we're doing this very well. What else can we do very well that solves a customer pain point? What else can we do where we can leverage the assets that we have and we can be uniquely good at, right? Where we can leverage our fleet on the ground, we can leverage our relationships with the vendors, we can leverage our captive audience and user base, etc. And then also what other things we can do to integrate more vertically in our supply chain, right? Kind of B2B services to our vendors or to our riders that may need, fintech services or things like that. So we believe more into starting from what you can do very well and expanding gradually into serving that customer base more and more and solving their pain points without getting too far from your core.
Thank you. Mostafa, your turn. You set up SWVL or Uber for buses with two of your friends.
I hate that.
You hate that. You need to get people to take that out of the brochure.
You are the SWVL of cars.
The SWVL of cars. You've had some serious expansion anyway since you set this up. How are super apps disrupting previously untapped markets?
I actually kind of share sorry, Mudassir again, but I share what Tomaso kind of believes in. I think other than China and maybe Southeast Asia, which have kind of a very unique landscape and a very unique kind of regulatory landscape specific,
sure.
I think super apps can be a bit confusing for a user, speaking from a user point of view.
Okay.
So usually companies kind of take a stab at it when, let's say, there is another opportunity of growth with another opportunity of monetization, creating more average revenue per user. But then a lot of times, this actually ends up being distracting to the user, right, from a user experience. So what SWVL is trying to take a step at is actually, first of all, there's an ample room in transportation, right? Like building a really global transit tech company where you're really able to build software to governments even, right? And governments, if you look at some of the most sophisticated public transportation systems in the world, like take London, for example, they're extremely rigid. The infrastructure that you probably see today existed 20 years ago. So how do you really build the next gen of transportation that's entirely algorithmically driven, that's totally kind of responsive to the environment within? I think there's a huge scope within that we need to cover that ground first before kind of going anywhere else. But I agree with kind of what Tomaso was saying, and I think the example of Apple is amazing here, building this ecosystem of products that as a user can really trap you in and increase your retention massively without distracting you, with kind of the core of the customer experience at the center of this.
Do you think there's ever a risk for the super apps to hold back innovation by building monopolies in digital interactions?
I think the problem is different. I think trying to do too much, a lot of breadth, with not necessarily a lot of depth, can hinder innovation for companies that are trying to push in that direction. I think taking a problem statement and solving it and really understanding the customer base and what they're really their pain points, and really trying to solve those pain points before branching out into more and more things, I think for us is kind of the way to go.
Fadi, would you say that super app companies have become the new regional geoeconomic power players?
They can be, they're not there yet. So, I mean, well, I'd like them to be powers. I mean, I don't know if they're geoeconomic powers, but we're way, way away from having them as really influential powers on the ground. We need to get them there so that there is, look, I'm going to agree with Mudassir on the discussion. And I don't think there's too much of a difference on what's being discussed here. So if we're in agreement that we're moving into the digital economy and the consumer is moving to acquire all his services through digital platforms, then that's what super apps are at the end of the day. They are platforms, as Mudassir said, where you are creating the infrastructure which was not in existence before, and having different players. I mean, again, the issue of the monopoly. We don't want monopolies, but we want platforms where different companies and different startups and different services and different products sit on these platforms that have done the heavy lifting on behalf of whatever, regulators or whoever, so that you can enable the ecosystems and thus become ecosystem enablers and nurturers of entrepreneurship and product building services across the countries that they are operating in. It's essential. I mean, there has to, the issue of scale and the hindrance of scale and the different hurdles of scale in the region are legendary. Legendary. I mean, we could do so much more if there is that a process of the ability to scale across countries, specifically in the GCC, because you're at the 6th largest economy in the world. The GCC is the 6th largest economy in the world. High, very high purchasing power. It's not about population, it's about purchasing power. But we are not taking advantage of that power in the proper way. And so when people talk, do we want to replicate Silicon Valley here? I say Silicon Valley has it easy. Because you launch in Silicon Valley and you're in America. But when you launch in this region, you're in a single country and you have to take it cross-border. So it's a challenge.
So what are the first steps to making those changes? If you had the power now?
And that's why we're talking here. I've been preaching, so I feel sometimes like I'm a preacher for the past 20 years about having an enabling environment through the regulatory process. You need to engage governments in this region. I mean, and I know every government is excited to enable entrepreneurship. It's not only about money. So if you are going out and investing, and there are the amount of new funding coming into our markets is incredible, but it's not enough. It's not only about money. It's about opening borders. It's very simple. The first step is to have a serious discussion with regulators, with governments, around how can we actually help from the entrepreneurship and from the startup ecosystem side of things to talk regionally, not only on a country-by-country basis. So bring all the players around one place. So maybe this is very... I'm dreaming about this, but it's doable. It's happened in other markets in the world. I don't see why it can't happen in our market.
No, thank you, Fadi. No, Fadi mentioned there about different markets, and as we said earlier, global ventures have investments across 10 different markets, and we said, 56 investments across 10 markets. How have you seen the super app driving various industries that you have invested in?
So the short answer is we haven't, right? So this goes back to kind of Tomaso's point and so on. really it is about the customer journey. So we've seen it a little bit in the Gulf, specifically with Careem and others that are really going to the perspective of we own this sector, what else can we offer our customers, similar to Tomaso. I do think there's a huge need for it in the sense that once you've gone through the painful customer journey of onboarding yourself into some of these platforms, not always technology painful, but sometimes regulatory painful, does it not then make sense that that becomes your home base and you just get all your services there? So I think the irony is that the customer pain point here in this part of the world is the regulation. And so simplifying it that it is cross-border regulatorily approved before you even get there is actually incredibly helpful because you've solved the biggest customer pain point. Whereas in other parts of the world, that is not the biggest customer pain point, to Fadi's point. So it really becomes, how do I create a market? How do I solve a customer problem? How do I create a consumer journey that people actually want and desire, rather than trying just to nudge myself and try to make space for myself in a market that already exists? How can I create value as an entrepreneur or as a super app? So where we invest across the Middle East and Africa, there is not a proliferation of super apps. It's not Asia. There is simply a proliferation of entrepreneurs trying to solve real problems, one problem at a time, like Mudassir did in the beginning. And then as they succeed, they can hopefully aggregate or go on to solve other problems in the customer journey problem. But right now, the biggest pain point is this regulatory side. So there is a need for a super app, because as you go as a customer from market to market, it would be nice to keep everything in one place and nice not to have to reinvent the wheel, since that is the biggest pain point.
We've talked there about different areas of the globe, and you touched on Asia. Now, Tomaso, before you went to Talabat, you previously worked at Singapore-based Grab. You know, that is Southeast Asia's leading super app. You know, what difference did you see there, and what did you take away from that role upon moving to Dubai?
I think it's exactly what I said before, right? So when I was at Grab, we were building the super app of Southeast Asia, right? That was mainly composed by ride-hailing plus food delivery plus financial services, right? And before that, I was at Uber. I was running Uber Eats, right? And when we started building food at Grab, we discovered that the fact of having ride sharing was not driving the synergies that we thought it would drive. So you still had to incentivize all the customers to come and order food, because the customer who wants to order a car is not the same customer that wants to order food, or will not come to your app thinking I want to order food, right? So to change that perception takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money, and not less money than what it costs you to create a pure play app. And you can see it in the US, for example, where DoorDash came later than Uber in the food game. And despite Uber, now we could say, being a super app of having ride sharing and food, still DoorDash gained higher market share than Uber, still has a much higher profitability in terms of EBITDA versus Uber Eats specifically. And the same you could say for Grab in financial services. Today, last quarter, they reported earnings for $5 million revenues and a burn of 13 million revenues and a burn of 115 million, right? So I think it seems that, building a financial services on top of a super app is not bringing there any other advantage versus starting a pure play, right? So I'm not saying this is the wrong thing to do, but just there's no proof around the world except China that this works. And in China, the reason why it worked is that because it was starting from a customer pain point, right? Which is not happening in the rest of the world when people think about super apps, in my opinion.
Thank you. Mudassir, you're very keen on learning how to scale growing organizations. Where does the super app fit into that process?
Yeah, look, I think let me defend the super app first. Look, in a world where money is cheap, in a world where money is free, you can build as many apps as you want. You can acquire as many customers as you want on those apps. and go through all the hurdles of building that infrastructure that's required. And it probably still makes sense for the big opportunities. It probably still makes sense for things like food delivery, buses, because these are big categories in themselves. But there are many things that are not as big. And if you want to unlock all the different services that people need to live their lives, it doesn't make sense to make those investments. I'll give you a simple example, but it applies to many more things. For the last 2 years, many of us have been going through PCR testing.
Sure.
Do you think it makes sense for an app for PCR testing to get built with all the enabling things, to get marketed, to get all this stuff? It is prohibitively expensive. But with the Careem Super App, there's a service in Dubai. They built a PCR service. We brought them on our app. And the majority of their business now comes through the Careem Super App.
Sure.
And this is just one example, right? There are many other services that would not make sense for the investment in the new world that we are going into. That would make sense. And once you start bringing those services that people need, you start the flywheel. Now, people will open the Super App for not just one or two core services, but for many other services that would otherwise not exist. And at some point, I would argue that would say, why the hell am I not using food on this app as well and doing bus on this app as well? And then that's when the game changes. And I also hear the point on distraction, right? I think it's a problem that needs to be cracked, because once you put too many things, it's difficult to find those things. But we live in an era when man has gone to the moon. You're telling me that AI cannot solve the problem of what does a user need right now. This is solvable. Have you solved it yet? No, but it's not something that cannot be cracked. Before the person opens the app, we can predict, or we should be able to predict, what does the person need right now, and just offer them the service that they need and make sure the clutter goes away. Now, to your question of organization, I think that's a real challenge. I don't think from a customer standpoint, the Super App does not make sense. The customer standpoint makes sense. You do many things once, you don't need to repeat them on different apps. But how do you pull that off organizationally? That's the tricky part. How do you become as good in food as someone else, or as good in bus as someone else? And that's the tricky part. And the way that we approach this is, look, we will do things that we have some license to win in. We built ride-hailing. Logistics is what we know. Delivery, somewhat adjacent to logistics. You build some of those things. But for everything else, you are basically a platform that allows third parties to come on board. So they'll come on board, they'll build their own businesses, they'll just benefit from the enabling infrastructure, the demand, and some other layers that we have on top. But for the most part, these things are run by third parties. And even the services that we run, we're trying to run them more and more as startups within Careem. So there is a head of ride-hailing, head of food, and we're basically telling them that you should be as good as someone from outside in the core service, but you should just get a boost from being on the Careem Super App. So I think this is the real nut to crack in my mind, because I think the customer journey, I have to believe that that's an easy thing to solve. The efficiency of these super apps and the business model to do multiple things on the same app that unlocks value that you can pass on to customers, that's an easy one to solve. Organizationally cracking it is the hardest nut, which is what we're working on at the moment.
Mostafa, how integral is the Super App to the future direction of your company?
Yeah, I think, again, right, we believe in being a platform, right? Definitely there's a lot of merit to, as serving the region, basically being a super app. As to Mudassir's point, which I totally agree with, building or allowing others to build on your platform that you've kind of spent quite a bit of money and done a lot of work kind of building is enabling to a lot of people who potentially otherwise could not have been able to build that. But I think when there are opportunity in an environment where hurdle rates have completely changed and the people's kind of look at money has really changed from even just 6 months ago, right? I think the depth and focus towards solving one problem statement, solving to the nth level, and it was what matters to us. So for us, we don't really believe, or we don't really see a future for us being a super app. We definitely believe in building kind of the best, let's say, one-stop solution, for example, for enterprises, for governments, right? Which there are a lot of kind of things that they still need, and there's still no platforms that are able to provide this operating system. But crossing into, let's say, things that are kind of remotely related to what we do, to our core business, and just sticking it on the fact that the user comes to the SWVL app every day, I think we're steering away from this.
Fadi, we've talked about a lot of things that need to be changed and the direction we're going in. Is there a magic formula? Is there a magic formula to the Super App?
You mean to solve the conflict between those gentlemen?
Yeah, I just want to settle the argument.
I think each has his. There is an argument for each. I have no problem. I mean, there is. He can fix his. Fix the problems of people that are using mass transportation across many different countries and many different segments of the market. I mean, that's doable. So he's a super app in the mass transportation space. So I don't see that there needs to be one answer and one solution for the pain points that we are facing in solving some of the problems that the consumer is looking at. So no magic formula. It's hard work. Each one has to go out and solve for what he knows best. I think it's good for the ecosystem that happens. Actually, it's very healthy.
Diplomacy there.
And have Noor invest in all of them.
Of course, no, exactly. Listen, we'll take the friendly debate off stage now. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, thank you so much for being with us today. If you could take your hands of a round of applause for our guests. Thank you.